Welcome back. We're again in the studio with Walter and Sonica Fight. We've just learned about your first evangelistic series with Francois Duplessis and all the things that transpired, how much opposition you had. And you were doing this all while you were in debt, weren't you?
Yes.
That's rather an interesting thing to do. Most people would find a second job, but you decided, no, you're going to do God's work.
You must remember that I had been living in error. I was an atheist. I had terrible experiences in my home. Religion had lied to me about what the Bible said. There was no such thing as everlasting torment that God in his wrathful nature would throw someone in. Coming from an atheistic experience, when I read books like Dawkins, The God Delusion, where he hates God with a passion. And I think to myself, but that was me. And I read his books and I see why he hates God, not because of what God says, but because of what theologians say about what God says. I was driven. I had to help people to get over that mindset. God is not what the world says out there. God is worth following, and truth is worth unearthing.
So what happened with your university? You were in university, you were working as a professor while you were doing this evangelism?
Well, how did I become a professor in the first place? That's quite a miracle. I mean, I'm in the zoology department. Zoology departments don't employ creationists. They just don't. You're either an evolutionist and you have that mindset, or you're not a zoologist. So I was merely relieving when I was appointed at the university, and it was a temporary position. And for a while there, I actually went and taught in a temporary position in another university when that temporary post was no longer available. And so at one stage they phoned me and said, there is a lecturership available, which was quite a step down for me. I mean, I was senior lecturer before, now step down. And they said to me, apply, you'll get the position because you've worked for us now and things work well, and come and apply. So I applied for it, and the professor said, piece of cake. And then finally he phoned me and he said, sorry, not piece of cake, because things had changed in South Africa and we had affirmative action. That meant that I wasn't of the right race to be appointed. So I lived with that, and then the next thing that happened was he phoned me back and he said, on the list you were secundus, that means you were the second, because we first had to give the opportunity to set the record straight in South Africa. But that person declined because the salary was too low. So you're the next in line, would you accept that salary? Well, I had nothing, so any salary was fine. So I said, sure, I'll accept that salary. So I was appointed as lecturer. And being academic all my life, I got involved in research. But my point was, what kind of research was I now going to do? Because my research was purely phylogenetic, it was physiology, but it was based on evolutionary principles, and I wasn't going to do that anymore. Now, fortunately, as a comparative physiologist, you can get involved in any type of research using animals as a model. So I wanted to become involved in research on nutrition and health using animals as a model.
Why did you get interested in that field, nutrition?
Well, it's a long story. When we became Seventh-day Adventists, when we were baptized, we knew nothing about spirit of prophecy. Both of us, we were baptized, knew nothing about, nobody told us anything about spirit of prophecy. I didn't know what it was. And then one day, while we were still on the farm, there was a colporteur who used to come by between two cities, Port Elizabeth and Cape Town, and we were sort of in between, and he would come by and he'd give us some books, and we had all these funny books, but we didn't know what they were, Ellen G. White and stuff like that, so we just put them down there. One day I got a phone call from an ex-colleague of mine, and he went ballistic because I'd become an Adventist. And he was so irate that I had become part of the sectarian movement. And then eventually he let loose a tirade against Ellen G. White that was second to none, calling her names that I do not want to repeat on television. And I thought to myself, oh, that's interesting. If someone's so angry against this person, maybe this person has something interesting to say. And so I went and I looked these books that this colporteur had brought, and one of them was called Desire of Ages. And that's the first one I ever read. And I started reading Desire of Ages, and I was so impressed. This was the most amazing thing I'd ever read, and if anything takes you to the Bible and uplifts Jesus Christ, then it is that book. And of course, even the world says it's the best book that has ever been written on the life of Christ in existence. And I don't think there are hardly any people that are prominent in religious fields that haven't made use of that book to further their depth of knowledge of what pertains to Jesus. But of course, this person also writes on issues of health and other issues. Now, I didn't read any of that stuff yet, none of it. Now, the irony of everything is we had a dairy farm. We had a dairy farm. And my poor wife, unbeknown to her or to me, couldn't handle the dairy at all. She had asthma all her life. You tell that.
I had very bad asthma. I had a pump that I carried with me. And at that stage, while we were on the farm still, suddenly I just one day got terrible earache. When I got to the doctor, the eardrum had burst from infection, and we still didn't know that it had anything to do with what we were eating. And so when we were back in Somerset West, I was going from one doctor to the next, and an internist or nobody could find anything wrong. They couldn't tell me why I still had asthma. And I eventually came to a young doctor, a lady, and she looked at me and she said, "You have allergic asthma. So you're allergic to something that you're eating, and I would suggest it is dairy." And I said, "Dairy? Never. I mean, dairy is good food. You can't live without it. It's got calcium, it's all the good stuff." But she said, "Go home and try. Just stop eating dairy for about 3 months and see what happens." And that's what I did. I went home, and now I had the family against me, because now suddenly we were not having milk anymore, no yogurt, no cheese, nothing. And
Me, rebellious?
Very rebellious. Oh. And he was a person who would take a pan after we were baptized already. The Adventists would often invite us for potluck, and he would come there and he would have his steak, huge steak, fried in a pan, and he would go and stick the pan under their nose and say, "This is food, not that rubbish that you're eating." So he was very rebellious in the beginning, and it's actually quite ironical that the Lord used him eventually to do research on health.
But let me just chip in there. We were still on the farm. I was not interested in the health message at all. These Adventists with their funny diets, I used to as she said, make them smell what food is all about. And then one day, totally separate from this, we had guests. And these were ex-colleagues of mine, university colleagues. And they came to visit us, and we did the normal thing that we normally did. We had a huge barbecue. And at that stage, were we still drinking even wine? I don't think so.
No.
We'd given up wine drinking. We weren't drinking alcohol anymore. In fact, we'd thrown away a whole room full of alcohol. We threw it down a septic tank, not realizing that the whole septic tank would then pack up and we'd have to get someone to remove it all. And I still remember the man who came with a truck to remove it. He said, "Never smelled a septic tank like that. Fruity, what's in it?" It was all our alcohol that was in it. But after this, these people arrived and they ate and we had this barbecue. The next morning, both of us at the same time said, "There's something wrong with us. There's something wrong with what we are doing here," but we didn't know why. And then I started reading about health and issues like that, and started reading Spirit of Prophecy writings on health, and then her story with the milk and the asthma and all of these issues. And then I started making a list. I systematically took the writings of Ellen G. White on health, and I made a long list of improbable things. You shouldn't eat this, you shouldn't eat that, we weren't designed for animal proteins, and the Bible says, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree with fruit on it, and it shall be yours for food." That was the original diet. So that was seeds, grains, nuts, fruits. That was the diet. There were no vegetables, nothing. And then she writes about all of that stuff. And then after transgression, vegetables were added. And vegetables are needed to augment something that is gone. You know, the earth was cursed. After that, after the flood, animal products were added, but with certain prohibitions. No blood, no unclean animals. So I first started off with that, right? My unclean and clean animals. And I thought, well, there must be a difference between the two. Why is this one clean and why is that one unclean? And there's fascinating research that has been done, that when you take extracts of unclean animals and you do experiments with plants and the growing rate of plants, where you add the unclean extract, they're suppressed. The whole plant is suppressed, the growth, so it affects the genetics. And the unclean animals and the clean animals, there are vast differences in the growth rate, so it does affect it. One of the first questions I asked is, well, what's wrong with animal protein? The first thing that comes to mind is protein. Who cares? You're going to digest it and it's going to end up as amino acids. There can't be any difference between a plant protein and an animal protein. They're both made of the same thing. And then I started doing research on the proteins. And I took all these writings as a guide. And I made a long, long list of all the strange things. And all of a sudden, as a lecturer, I had many students, and they were interested in what I was doing. So I had them do experiments. And I'd say to them, all right, we'll do an experiment. You will have this project, you will have that project. We will compare plant protein versus animal protein on the health status and growth of rats. That animal. And then strange things. Some other scientists came and they said, they have this massive problem of sheep that develop skew legs when they are stall fed. And why have they got skew legs? They cannot walk, their legs are buckled, there's nothing wrong with their diet. And one person had attended my lecture where I said there's a difference between plant protein and animal protein, because the ratio of amino acids is different. And if you have animal proteins, then there are more sulfur-containing amino acids than there are in plant proteins. And when you have to metabolize them, then you're actually producing sulfates, which will leach out calcium out of the system. And he picked up on this and he said, do you think it's possible that the stall-fed animals get skew legs because we're feeding them animal protein? And I said, absolutely, that's what's happening. And he says, nah, this can't be. But he got intrigued and got involved, and eventually we applied for funding. And the government funding said, we won't fund that. There's no difference between proteins. Plant protein is plant protein and animal protein is animal protein. We will not fund such nonsense. So I went to my university and said, the government doesn't want to fund it. Will you give me a grant? They were reticent, but they gave me a little grant. And this other place, which was a experimental farm, they gave a grant. And so we started our research. Now what they feed stall-fed animals is fish meal. Fish meal together with other things. So we had experiments with animals that didn't have it and animals that did get it, those that were plant-based, those that had different percentages of animal protein. And the results were phenomenal. Phenomenal. Absolutely amazing. The more animal protein they received, the skewer their legs got. They just deteriorated. And it was statistically absolutely thunderous. And this started getting momentum. And so when these results came out, and I could make a case that there was really a difference between plant protein and animal protein, then the government started funding this research.
Is this the Royal Society London grant?
No, not yet. Now, this just basically means that I got more and more students. Mm-hmm. And then I got very interested in disease and the transfer of disease and why animals would have bacteria which become antibiotic resistant, for example. And why this was becoming an epidemic, antibiotic resistance. And then I suggested that because farm animals are fed antibiotics, pro forma, they're given antibiotics because it improves the growth rate, that this was causing antibiotic resistance. And so I started getting students in that direction, and I had PhD students, and my research just grew exponentially. And then our professor, he got sick, he got cancer, and he died. So now there was a vacancy, a professorial position. And my university, because my research had grown, came to me and said, I must apply for the position. So I applied for the position, and I was the candidate that on paper had, well, the best probability of getting it. So they didn't want to appoint me because some people said, but he doesn't believe in evolution. You can't have a professor in a secular university that doesn't believe in evolution. So they decided to have a search committee to find someone else for this position. And finally they found someone from a top international, non-South African, European university, one of the best, who also had to have other criteria because they wanted to correct gender inequalities and race inequalities and all of those things. So they settled on the gender thing, so they appointed someone else also in that position. It's a long, interesting story, and I'm not going to go into it, but eventually they appointed both of us as professor, and then the one, through very strange circumstances, didn't take up the position, so I was the only professor. So here was a secular university that had appointed someone who didn't believe in evolution. And the conversation, so I gathered afterwards, was something like this. We cannot appoint this man, he's controversial. He doesn't believe in evolution. Yes, but he has the certificates, he has the criteria. And being a post-struggle university, eventually someone said, but controversial is good. We're sick and tired of the status quo. Why not have someone controversial? And that's how I actually got the position. But of course it created opposition from within. You would have opposition. And the students, they would ask me in the classes, why don't you believe in evolution? And I would say to them, I'm sorry, it's not part of the curriculum. The curriculum is evolution. I don't believe it, but that doesn't mean that I can now spend university money and university time to tell you why I don't believe it. But if you're interested, arrange a lecture after hours and I'll tell you. And I did. They would, don't tell a student that, right? So they would arrange lectures after hours and I'd give my lectures. And then they'd sit in the evolution classes and they'd say, sorry, it's not like that, it's like that. And the lecturer would say something and they'd say, it's not like that, it's like that. And of course, what happens? They start getting irritated with us and saying, I'm indoctrinating the students. So there was tremendous antagonism from within. And eventually they would gather enough of so-called evidence against me to make a case against me. And then the university was required to investigate the issue. But something else happened before this that made me almost an untouchable in the university. And sometimes terrible things that happen and trials that come serve a totally different purpose. For example, we had terrible riots in South Africa because of the apartheid issue. And these riots always spilled over onto university campuses. And this was the fermenting ground. And so we would have activists come in from outside and try to dictate issues. And the university was in constant flux. And the whole nation would be inundated with this. And they would close all universities and throw rocks and beat up people and throw petrol bombs. And it was chaotic. It was a very bad situation. And you couldn't drive anywhere you wanted to. And if you drove through some areas, you would be necklaced. Now, you know what a necklace means? When they put a tie around your neck and they pour gasoline into it and set it alight and burn you alive. So it was extremely dangerous. It was even dangerous for me to drive to work. I was shot at 3 times. I had to once dive behind a wall. On the university campus, there was a huge riot and the bullets were whizzing past me. And it was very, very dangerous. I was once involved in a drive-by shooting because there were a new economy was developing and the taxis had to now take over the transport system and transport hundreds of thousands of people, and buses were transporting, so there were wars between taxis and bus companies. And sometimes people in taxis would drive past buses full of people and they would kill everyone. They would just shoot indiscriminately into the buses. And I was involved in one where the bus was in front of me and I was behind it, and the taxi came past and they were shooting with AKs. And they killed the bus driver, and the bus rolled. And chaotic situations, like very dangerous situations. And then there was this riot on the campus, and the university had decided lectures continue, but they didn't know how bad it was going to be. So I said, I was then professor and head of the department, so I said, lectures go ahead, everybody as normal. And then the rolling violence started. What do they call that?
Toy.
Toying, yes, but rolling action, whatever. I can't remember what they call it. Rolling mass action. That's when they come and they rhythmically come through. And if they found then people in the lectures, they would beat them up. They would hit them with baseball bats, they would smash knees, they would kick the ladies in the faces. They were terrified of this. And before you could do anything, they were in the building. They were coming in the building. And I saw they were coming, and it's thousands. There's nothing you can do. There's no way you can get out. That's it. They're going to come through the building. And they're going to open the lecture halls, and they're going to drag the students out, and they're going to beat them up. And I'd given instructions. So I ran to the lecture hall where the students were, and I went and stood in front of double doors. Now, these double doors are just normal double doors, as in the studio, in fact. And there's just a clip holding it to one side, and the other side is locked onto the other door. I'm standing in front of these doors, and I'm facing these hundreds coming in, and they're violent. And the whole campus was full of riot police as well. So the riot police came running with their riot gear and their shotguns and their rubber bullets and what have you. And they stood in a semicircle where I was standing. And then these people confronted me and said, there are students in there. And I said, yes. And they said, get out the way. And I said, no. And they said, why not? And photographers from the press, I said, no, it's my responsibility. I said these lectures continue, so if you want to deal with someone, you have to deal with me. And they said, I must get out the way. And I said, no, I won't. And then they start rhythms, and then they just came forward, like vroom, 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 vroom. And they just came. Now, this is hundreds of them, hundreds, and thousands outside, and they're all streaming in, and they pushed me against the door. And such force, you cannot believe it. I could hear my ribs cracking, and you can't breathe. They're going to crush the life out of you. And the door, theoretically, should just snap open. Didn't. It withstood that pressure. And then for no reason they would go back. And I'm looking at the riot police. Hello?
Yeah.
Are you going to help me here?
I was wondering.
Not one finger. They didn't lift a finger. And they came again 7 times. And there was just one man, actually 2 came to help me. The one was a worker, technical worker, and the other one was a lecturer. And they came to help me because they tried to get hold of the fire extinguisher to spray us with fire extinguisher. And so they prevented them from doing that. They held on to the fire extinguishers. But these guys just kept on crushing me 7 times. And I thought, well, this is it. I'm going to die now. And I prayed and I said, well, Lord, help me. Because I've got no one to help me. The riot police are not doing anything. And then all of a sudden the leader said, ah, and they walked out. The whole lot just turned around and they walked out. And they went into the next building and smashed it. They took microscopes and expensive equipment and just threw it out of the buildings and beat up students, but nothing happened to my students.
You were very popular as a result of that, I think.
I was untouchable. Untouchable from then onwards. But it only lasts for a while, right? And so the trials started coming when they had this first case. And I don't know what they'd done, but they had a long list of grievances. And so the university appointed a commission. And this commission had flown in to investigate it. But I didn't know what the grievances were. I didn't know what the situation was. And the one colleague of mine, he was the one who had the list of grievances. Now I'm sitting in my office and the commission is meeting over there. My secretary is opposite me in another office and the other colleagues are around and I'm waiting for this to happen now. And so finally they call him for witness. Comes out, he comes up to my secretary's office, which is just opposite mine, takes a breath, and he falls over. Unconscious. And this is a young man.
This is the man who opposed you.
Well, they were all, but he had the list.
The list.
Yes. Falls over. There he is. Unconscious. So they call the paramedics. The paramedics come. They rush him out on a stretcher, wheel him out, off into the ambulance. He's gone. So the commission says, well, we've all flown in now. What's going on here? So the only thing is they have the list. So they decide to carry on with the proceedings. So they call me in and they say, well, this is a grievance. You indoctrinated the students to do this and that, or not to do that, or to believe not this and that and the other. And I said, excuse me, it wasn't like that. And they had witnesses. I said, no, it wasn't like that, it was like this. No, it wasn't like this, it was like that. Now, who's right, right? So I said, well, I have a solution. Why don't you get the whole class? Why call one witness here and one witness there? Get the whole class, and they can tell you whether this is so or whether this is not so. So the whole class was called, and they were to witness then. And I was exonerated. So the whole thing came to nothing. And the next day, he was back at work. They couldn't find anything wrong. But at exactly that moment, he was unconscious. And that's quite an experience. Another experience I had while all this was going on is there was another riot. And I was in the Senate building at the time. The Senate had come together. Now that's all the professors and the leaders. And it was a wage dispute, but it had nothing to do with the university. It was a government issue. But as it always is, they take it out on the lowest denominator, so they took it out on the university. So they were surrounding the building, and everybody was thinking, that's it, we're all going to be destroyed here now. This is the end. And they'd surrounded the Senate building, which had very high glass windows. And then I suggested that somebody speak to them as a sort of intermediary, and the lot fell on me. So I went to speak to them, but now I'm coming to them and they're on the other side of the glass, and I'm trying to speak to them through the glass. And I'm telling them, it's not the university's problem. If they have a problem, they must go and riot at the parliament, because it's a parliamentary decision, whatever it was, wages that had been cut or something. But they were violent. The building was completely surrounded. None of us could get out. And then they started rhythmically hitting the windows. Now, you know what it's like when you add rhythm to a building or to a bridge, it can collapse. But this is a strong structure, and they rhythmically started hitting the windows, these big windows. And the next minute, it's like the glass exploded. Just, and it came down like rain. And all of a sudden, there was nothing between me and the crowd. Nothing, no protection. And I faced them. And for momentarily, because all this glass came down, they were shocked into silence. And with this, all this crowd came running round to where I was facing these students. Or I don't believe it was students. It was rioters brought in by the busload from outside. And I was facing them. And there was nobody around me except this. And now I'm trying to reason with this person. It's impossible. You cannot reason. It doesn't happen. It doesn't work. But using this opportunity, because everybody was facing me now I'm saying prayers in my head. This is a serious situation. The senators used the back door to get out.
To escape.
They all escaped. Here I'm standing. And then some realized that the senators had all left the building and they tried to prevent it. So they all ran round to the other side of the building to prevent it. And there was nobody in front of me anymore. And I just calmly walked out of there, back to my office. Nothing happened. So I had all these fascinating experiences, and they strengthened me and strengthened my position. Eventually it did get so far that they had another commission and another commission, and it was very unsavory because there were accusations that my students were being intimidated, that some of them had unplugged the refrigerators so that the students' work would go to, be destroyed. And there were accusations against some of my students of impropriety. And the whole thing became very unsavory. And then in the final commission, they decided that the complaint was, you cannot be a scientist and believe in God at the same time. You see, what had happened, in the course of all this research that I was doing, it became so big that the Royal Society in London had granted a grant to the university which was given to me. I was the only biologist in the country who got a grant to further reconstruction and development. And this was huge money and huge prestige because it involved the dukes and the Royal Society and the Lords of England and financial liaisons between Cambridge and Oxford and South Africa. And I was right in the middle of this, and I was funded with a lot of money. And this creates tension and jealousy, and in academia these things happen. And so some of these pressures then came to the point where you cannot be a scientist and have this huge quantity of money at your disposal and believe in God at the same time. And the commission eventually decided that that was unconstitutional. Because then you are saying that religious freedom doesn't exist. You're entitled to believe in God. So they actually told me that I can take my university to court for allowing such things, but I didn't want to. So I resigned, but they graciously declined my resignation. But I said I no longer want to be in the zoology department. But my research was so medical at this stage that I just transferred to the medical department. And so for the last few years of my academic career, I didn't have the evolutionary pressure on me.
You wrote a book on health, diet and health, scientific perspectives. Tell us more about your dairy research.
Yes, well, the dairy research actually started with you, right?
Yes. I remember I told you about
The asthma.
the asthma, and I went home and I started making other kinds of milks, nut milks and soy milks, and I improved within 6 months. I no longer used my pump. I never had asthma after that again, ever. And that actually got him, because he was a little bit behind me in the health thing, because it was difficult for him to make the change over, and the food didn't taste the way he was used to. So it was a bit of a challenge for him. But after he saw the success, with my asthma, he decided he's going to really research this and use it at university level.
And I had a student who was a PhD student, so we started dairy research. And we got in with the medical faculty of another university, and we started a project with vervet monkeys that were very close in their physiology to humans. And we fed some, the normal grain varieties, as a diet, and added dairy to the other, and had a look at what the effect of dairy was. And it was absolutely phenomenal. It was such a huge project that this student actually became a postdoctoral Harvard fellow and went to Harvard. There are only a handful in the world that are chosen for that. And the student actually then proceeded later to become a professor of an alternative medicine faculty that was created. So there's great things that happened out of this research. And the Royal Society was very excited about it. And so I was very involved in dairy research. And I was fascinated that the Spirit of Prophecy wrote and said that it was in the writings that dairy was never part of the original diet, and that eventually it would be excluded. And that cheese was totally unfit for food. So, of course, I then decided that we need projects to prove this, right? And I had so many students, everyone needed a research project, so I'd had them all on these different aspects, and I would say to the students, all right, this is what I want you to do, and then I'd say, I predict that this one will be the best one, and that one will be second best, and that one will be the worst. And the students, of course, were rebellious. Never! Won't be like that. And then when the results came out and the blood parameters were all analyzed, and the hormone levels and all the parameters that go along with health issues, they were stunned, because it was always exactly like that, or combinations of things. And I used all of this information and tested it empirically. And eventually, the students started saying, this man is like a prophet. He's telling us ahead of time what the results are going to be. And we don't want the results like that, but they're actually working out like that.
Now, this was the list that you had prepared.
That's the list, yes.
And didn't you systematically go through each item?
I went through each item and planned research on the basis thereof. But you don't have time for everything, right? And I was writing my book. At that stage, I was writing the book, Diet and Health, Scientific Perspectives, and I'd included all of this research. But there was one aspect that intrigued me, and that was that Ellen White writes that the combination of milk and sugar is bad for you. Mm-hmm. And I didn't have time to get a student to write this, to do a research project, because I was busy writing the book, and all the places were occupied, and I don't have another year to wait for the next intake. I want the information, and I want it right now. So I did a massive literature search, and in those days, computers were in the beginning. It's not as easy as it is now to do a literature search. It's major work. And I could find nothing. I spent hours and hours, and I had research assistants paging through all the abstracts to see whether there's any research that's been done on this. Nothing, but nothing. And so I'm sitting there in my office, and I'm saying, well, everything that I'm doing is working out exactly like I've read, but I really need this information. So, God, could you help me find something on this? I really need some information on this issue. And the next thing, I'm sitting there and telephone rings. And it's the professor of physiology. And he phones me, and he's a total flap. And he says, you know what, I've just had a problem, because the students are supposed to come to a lecture that I've organized for an outside researcher, but I forgot to tell them. And these students, many of them, of course, run different courses, and quite a few of these students were also in my courses, zoology. And I had the next lecture with the zoology students. So he said to me, can't you do me a favor and cancel your lecture and bring these students, otherwise this man has no audience. And I was upset because I was behind already and I was busy and I had so much to do with these students. But you have to be amiable, so I said, sure, I'll do it. And I was really upset. So when my lecture took place, I went to the students and I said, we're not having this lecture, we're going over to another lecture, so come, all of you. So we went across, so the man had an audience and I was irritated sitting in the back and wasn't really interested in what he was saying. And then he said, I was doing research for a chocolate company, and I was asked to research chocolate as an excellent food because we use it on rescue boats and this, and so they contacted me to show, or to do research to show how excellent and how good chocolate is for you. So the first thing I did was I sat down and I said, well, what does chocolate consist of? Well, there's milk, and there's sugar, and there's cocoa. So the obvious thing is, let's do research on milk and sugar and cocoa and combinations of milk and sugar. Well, a hornet at that stage stung me because I sat upright like a bolt. Here I'd been complaining and saying, oh, what a miserable thing, now I have to go there. Just 2 minutes before that, I'd prayed, I need help. I need something about milk and sugar. See how pathetic we are? Mm. God is in the detail. Yes. He's in the detail. So there he was lecturing. And he was saying what they did is they got groups of students, and then he was still joking because students will do anything for money. Mm-hmm. And he put the one group of students on the equivalent of the milk in a bar of chocolate, which is a glass and a half of milk in chocolate. So they drank the milk, and then they're monitored, and the blood is taken at regular intervals, and you measure the parameters, the cholesterol, the HDL, the LDL, the triglycerides, the whatever. You measure it all. And he says, well, they would all go up, and then they would peak, and then they would come down, and in about 3 hours, it's back to normal, the parameters. And then I'd do it for the sugar, and amazingly, you'd find the triglycerides go up, the cholesterol goes up, which you don't expect for the sugar, and then it levels out after a while. But they're hypoglycemic, so there's a problem there. And then he said, then I did the combination, milk and sugar. He says, it was a disaster. I'll never get funding from a chocolate company again. The parameters shot up more than double than they were originally, but they didn't come down. They stayed there. So you have these increased triglyceride levels and cholesterol levels. And so this combination is very, very harmful. And so I went to him afterwards and I said, where are you publishing this stuff? And he mentioned the journal that it was going to be published in. It was brand new research, not been published yet. And I said, well, that's wonderful. So I incorporated that in my book. So if someone's interested, they can find it there. But this is how God works. And this is how my health research developed.
Did you have any opposition on the dairy issue from outside?
Well, I'm sad to say, not only from the outside, but a fair amount from the inside as well. I remember when I gave my first camp meeting lecture that I lectured on this issue, and by a very fortuitous circumstance, someone very early in the morning gave me the quotes in the spirit of prophecy on the issue of dairy. And I was lecturing at this camp meeting, and some of the senior people got up during the lecture and opposed it vehemently. But I had some of the scientific data ready, and I hit them with the scientific data, and I gave them the spirit of prophecy, but it didn't help. It just got worse, the discussion. And then the audience started slow clapping the opponents. So this made it even more uncomfortable. So there was tremendous tension in that camp regarding the health issue. Now, in my country, chicken is considered a vegetable. You have meat for breakfast, and you have meat for lunch, and you have meat for supper. And now you still want to come and touch dairy? I mean, that's considered what? If chicken is a vegetable, then that is untouchable. You're not allowed to go there. But of course, this opposition also came from without, because the dairy industry is a powerful industry. And then the research, of course, with lactose intolerance came into the issue. And black people are highly lactose intolerant. So now you have issues like underfed people. Africa suffers tremendously from malnutrition. And you have thousands of people dying of hunger, and little children with bloated stomachs and thin little legs. You know the horrible pictures in the world. And what's the main food item that they sent these people? Loads and trainloads of dairy. These little children are lactose intolerant, and they get diarrhea. So what are you actually doing? You're furthering their demise. You're making it worse. And armed with this information, I had to tell it to the world, because in my opinion it was a travesty of justice. Not because people were willfully mean, but because of pure ignorance. So I went public with my research. And of course, the dairy industry was highly offended. So they flew down the dairy representatives from Pretoria, and they came to see me and confronted me with the issue and threatened to take me to court, to destroy me. And I'd appeared on national television, and I'd done a program on national television, and when I looked at the program, I didn't recognize it, because these people are brilliant. They had so cut what I'd said that any evidence that I'd given, they'd cut out. And they only made me make the statements, you know, where you look like a fanatic, and you're saying this and that and the other. So I looked like a total fanatic on this program, but it had done damage. Enough came through to damage the cause. So when they came down, they threatened me with a court case, and the university, of course, as well, because they were sponsoring my research, and Royal Society was involved in this research. So and these guys are huge. I mean, they're big dairy farmers. Big, highly intimidating. And they sat down and they said what they said, and then I said to them, hold it a second, if you want to take me to court, you're going to have to take the big universities to court too, because this is what is beginning to come out all over the world. And perhaps you don't have all the evidence, because what you saw on television was a fraction of what you should know. So I suggest you first come and sit down and listen. So I took them into the lecture theatre and I gave them a lecture. And I showed them one research project, one slide after the other. When it was finished, they came to me and they said, but it's going to destroy our industry. Can't you please just keep quiet about it? And I said to them, if I keep quiet about it, how will I deal with my conscience? There are thousands of people who are suffering from asthma, bronchial problems, little children who have constant infections, lung infections, ear infections. And then you have this massive contrast between the races and lactose intolerance. Do you want me to be partaker in this? I cannot. My conscience will not allow me. So they sort of begged me to keep quiet and left. And as they left, the one farmer, or the one on the dairy board, who was also a dairy farmer, came running back. And he sat down in my office and he looked at me sort of quietly like this. And then he said, "Is this really all true that you've said?" And I said, "Yes." And this big farmer burst into tears. And he said, "Every single thing that you have mentioned, my little girl has. And she's so sick. So I have been doing the best I can, and this is the result." And I said, "Well, try it. Give her a new lease on life." And he left. So this is emotional research. And wherever I went in the world later, I was tremendously opposed on this issue, not only from outside, but largely from inside as well, from high levels inside. So I always came up against this brick wall. So from then on, my life became one of battering ram. And it's not easy, but truth will have to triumph.
I think every time you touch someone's plate, it becomes personal to them, and it's an emotional link. And people like what they eat. They eat it. They want to take pleasure in it, and so it can be hard to give up these things. Were you the first one that promoted veganism in your country?
I was the first one that promoted veganism in my country. But when I went overseas, I didn't expect quite such a backlash. And in Europe in particular, I mean, some of these medical practitioners, they would bring their own PA systems and shout me down and tell me to go back to my bush where I come from. And I was also talking about prion diseases and other diseases that were coming. And they would shout, prion disease, who's ever heard of prion disease, go back to your bush. And then, of course, 4 years later, all of this actually hit the world.
Yeah.
And these issues, antibiotic resistance, the dairy issue, this all became public knowledge. And today we have massive industries, soya milk industries, alternative milk products. It didn't exist. It didn't exist at that time. So without being presumptuous, I can say that I'm grateful to God that at least I played a part in that awakening, so that people today have a choice, whereas then the choice was so limited.
Yeah.
There were people preaching it. There were people trying to introduce it, and the methodologies were there, but the push and the emphasis, that had not yet come.
And that God used you with your research. That's what needed to happen to get this out a little more prominently so that people can start having choices.
I can see the bumps on my head, but I think the fruits were good, and I'm grateful to God.
Well, thank you for joining us. We're going to take a break again, and we'll be back in another episode to hear further about your life experiences.